is what's called a dog's breakfast. I don't know if you've heard that expression before, but it's a mixture of things that I sort of see a unity, and maybe you won't see a unity in it. But I want to talk about the movement from Mexico to the United States between starting around 1910, a large-scale migrant movement from Mexico to the Midwest. And then I also want to talk about a large-scale permanent movement of African Americans, both partly as a result or connected to World War One. And they feed industries like Ford, and I want to talk a little bit about Fordism. That is a new kind of assembly line manufacturing. And I want to talk about rural-urban splits as well, because there's going to be increasing tension between these sort of immigrant cities and these sort of rural places that's going to be felt in the Prohibition movement, I think. The readings, by the way, are up. I was a little late in posting them, but they are there. McGurr and McGurr. And if you just want to respond to one of the McGurrs, either Lisa McGurr or Michael McGurr, that's fine with me. But those two readings are there. And basically what you'll see is two very different takes on the progressive movement. One that sees the progressive movement as a sort of, I don't know, a kind of revolt against immigrants and a kind of cultural war, which is Lisa McGurr's argument, and another that argues that there's a kind of issues about wealth distribution and things like that. That's Michael McGurr's argument. And so which one is more important? The one way of putting it is it progressive income tax that's the most important legacy of the progressive movement, which is what Michael McGurr would say, or is it prohibition, which is what Lisa McGurr would say? So two very different takes on that movement. So again, we'll talk about, I want to talk today about these movements and the rural-urban split that emerges in the 19-teens and how that contributes to the Prohibition movement. All right, so Mexico first. And we'll be stepping back in time a little bit. This is Porfirio Diaz on the left in 1870. It's about 1867, I think, when he's involved, shortly after he's been involved in the revolution against Maximilian, when France tried to take over Mexico during the American Civil War. And this is Diaz later. He's considered a war hero, and he becomes in 1876 president of Mexico, and he's replaced by someone else, and then he comes back in 1884 to 1910, and this is called the Porfiriato in Mexico, the period in which Porfirio Diaz is a ruler. And we talked before, remember, about social Darwinist ideas, survival of the fittest, and that sort of thing. Well, Porfirio Diaz and his group of the sort of elites who run Mexico, they call themselves the científicos, the scientific rulers, sort of, view most people in Mexico who are kind of indigenous Mexicans as being, held back and problematic and not assimilable. And so the finance minister says that the weak would have to yield to superior men. The finance minister is, of course, descended from Spanish, can draw a line back to Spanish conquistadors. Likewise, most of the people in the cabinet are like this. Porfirio Diaz himself, as well, says that indigenous Mexicans, quote, look to those in authority for leadership instead of thinking for themselves. And so Porfirio Diaz is very closely aligned with the Catholic Church. This is how he sees his sort of power operating. And in 1884, he passes something called the Law of Occupation and Disposal of Vacant Lands. Law of Occupation and Disposal of Vacant Lands, which is an attempt to make use of property in Mexico that Diaz thinks is underused. So what the law does is it creates surveying agencies that locate what they call vacant lands and survey them. And even if people live on them, the surveying company can decide that this land is vacant. If they survey it and declare that it's vacant, then the surveying company gets 1/3. Okay, so this is a terrible incentive. It's a really ridiculous plan, but it leads these these surveying companies to travel around Mexico to map out regions and then say basically this land is empty or mostly empty, and then sell the land. A lot of this happens in Mexico. About 30% of all of Mexican land, and Mexico is a massive country, 30% of Mexican land gets turned over to private interests in this period. Some of them are large landholders. In many cases, they're foreign mining firms and others. Claiming this land forces farmers and herders who had been living on this land for generations off the land and into the cities in Mexico. And so from 1884 until 1910, what we see is a sort of massive migration of people away from land that has been sort of claimed under Diaz's law and ending up in cities. There's massive urbanization and massive poverty in cities like Mexico City and elsewhere as a result of this. This is a kind of a powder keg that Porfirio Diaz is setting up, and that powder keg will go off in 1910 with the Mexican Revolution. Diaz is overthrown by a revolution in 1910, and it continues for 10 years. This is a very long revolution. Rival factions, Carranza and Pancho Villa on one hand, others, the sort of institutionalists fighting against them. At the same time, there are gangs of guerrillas who are claiming areas. Lots of parts of Mexico become somewhat unruly in this period. And the peso goes from, so we see somewhat stability of the peso under Porfirio Diaz, but a lot of poverty and a lot of difficulty. And sorry, here's a picture of one of the mines that's built in the Porfiriato. And then the revolution that comes, it's a powder keg, it's and a massive violent exchanges. We see basically rival factions blowing up railway stations, tearing up track, and the fighting back and forth between the rival factions actually tears up most of the railroad corridor and makes it actually impossible for Mexico to export very much. And as a result, sort of, yes, in general, supported Diaz, but the U.S. does try to, basically the U.S. supports Diaz. At the time of the revolution, though, Taft and others, they station troops. They occasionally, move in and attack in response to raids that were made into Texas and things like that. But the U.S. isn't as much a force in the Mexican Revolution as we'd like to think, or that Americans like to think. In fact, this is a revolution that's going on in Mexico, and the U.S. is sort of tries to keep out of it. Certainly Woodrow Wilson and others try to keep out of it. They do intervene at various points and maybe make things worse. But Diaz is really not a factor after 1910. He's gone. And so what we see is really this sort of rivalry and the U.S. occasionally involving itself, but not that much. So in any case, this leads to a massive exodus from Mexico, from the war, into the U.S. between 1910 and 1920. And this is not a bad thing for ranchers in South Texas, because this is a massive cheap labor force. At this point, all migration from Mexico to the U.S. is, of course, legal, as it always had been. Much of Texas had been part of Mexico before, but U.S. immigration law was, in general, didn't extend to the Western Hemisphere in this period. And so what we see then is, after around 1910, Michigan and Minnesota and other places like that are very interested in the labor that's available in the South, that there are lots and lots of people who might work. And so Michigan and Minnesota and lots of other places, they send private recruiters. Farmers send private recruiters down to Mexico to attract those folks to come and travel up to Michigan, Minnesota, and elsewhere, the Midwest, the upper Midwest, to work as farmers, to work as sugar beet workers, basically for the harvest. So this is from May to May to August, something like that, when the sugar beet harvest takes place, and so what we see is then lots and lots of Mexican sugar beet workers in these regions, and what's called a migrant stream that emerges in the early 20th century. Okay, I don't know. Yes, this is a class. It's also fun, but this is for a class. So there's a migrant stream of Mexican workers in this period, and much work, of course, in sugar beets. One reason back to why sugar beets. Why sugar beets in this period? Because remember those subsidies? Remember we talked before about all that sugar, the fact that the U.S. is importing an insane amount of sugar. Remember in 1890 when the Congress creates this new tariff? Yeah, welcome, Wraithburner. Well, this is the result, is the U.S. is subsidizing. I'm going to have to squeeze Battlestar Galactica in here. Subsidizing this sugar beet industry, and so the sugar beet industry is in the upper Midwest. Lots and lots of folks traveling up into this region. All right. So, while many young men and women from Mexico worked in sugar beet fields as migrants, they hoped to work for a place like Ford. Oh my goodness. And how has Word frozen up here? This could be very bad. Okay, I'm going to wing it. My lecture just, my Word file just froze. So, okay. So the Ford plant in 1913, Ford develops a new method of producing automobiles, a sort of mass delivery of automobiles. He's not exactly the first person to do this. I am going to kill a process here. In fact, of course, remember we talked about meat and how meat is created in this period, cut up and canned and things like that by Armour and Swift and others. Ford basically applies this to the manufacture of cars using mostly electrical motors. He figures out ways of lifting the car and moving the car through the assembly line to make it much more rapid, the manufacturing. Now let's hope that I get my lecture back. This could be very bad. All right. All right, bear with me here for a second. I've never done this before, but my Word file has died, and for some reason I can't find the lecture itself. Okay, here it is. He broke down production to its smallest parts, mechanizing the production with electrical motors, and created this sort of assembly line production. More than 50% of workers in the Ford Motor Company were foreign. These were there were a few literate straw bosses, as they were called, who learned enough to say "speed up" in Polish or in Czech, and the process of engineering is critical. So he follows the process. Ford follows the process. He tries to minimize the motion. He uses electrical motors to lift an engine. For most workers, this is incredibly boring work. Yes, it's true. Lots and lots of people wanted this work, and Ford paid his people really, really well. But I can say from experience, having worked in a factory that's similar to this, that this is incredibly boring work. A friend of mine who still works in a factory says being a troubleshooter on an assembly line is great, but being a regular sort of person on the job is it's mind-numbingly boring. But by reorganizing and routinizing this labor, Ford can lower his prices. That a number of laborers needed is drastically cut in this assembly line manufacturing. The Model T goes from $780 in 1910 to $360 in 1914. This kind of production moves to many other industries, like hosiery. It's very uneven. Between 1900 and 1930, business productivity increases fourfold, but in agriculture, it only increases by 50%. So we see a boom, really, in production and manufacture using this new assembly line method. The boom was fueled by consumer goods industries that are mostly used by city people. That's things like portable cameras, wristwatches, vacuum cleaners. The wristwatch is really an invention of 1914 and 1915. The idea that you were so important that you have to have your watch sitting on your wrist emerges in this period and becomes cheaper to make them. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, radios, telephones, rayon hose, and especially automobiles. If Ford was very restrictive, you had to be married, you couldn't be an alcoholic, you had to learn English and things like that. You also had to be white to work in Ford's Motor Company. You could not be black. You could not at first be Mexican, and so they were very restrictive about in a kind of racial way. Ford himself was kind of believed in white supremacy. He believed that Jews were manufacturing were kind of the hands behind, the invisible hand behind much modern changes. So he was an anti-Semite as well. But to work at Ford, particularly for these immigrant workers who are coming in, it's really fantastic work. It does create, though, these new manufacturing aimed at city workers and new city plants, like in Detroit, like in Pittsburgh, and elsewhere, create a very different life for city folks than for rural folks. The intensification of industrialization takes place in places that are already industrialized. So New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis. Areas that are called the Industrial Belt in the 19-teens. Now, in the 1980s, this is going to be called the Rust Belt. But it's a very different kind of place, and life in these cities is very different. Partly, this is a result of electrification. This is Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, and this is a very different experience of nighttime in, say, between 1900 and 1910, or 1890 and 1910, as we see urban electrification and sort of electric lights everywhere. Makes it possible to kind of stay up in the middle of the night. Rural areas, night is black as pitch. Going out to the outhouse in the middle of the night is dangerous. Nighttime in urban areas, though, are lit by electric lights. Most folks in cities have indoor plumbing. They have canned foods. They have restaurants. This is another Edward Hopper, and this, again, from this period, The Hotel by Railroad. Urban areas, readers of new popular periodicals, are the readers of new popular periodicals like Time and New Yorker. They saw themselves as urban sophisticates who like to ridicule rural people. And so this is the height of H.L. Mencken. You probably have heard a couple of quotes from H.L. Mencken. He was a reporter for the Baltimore Herald and becomes very popular from around 1906 forward. He is the one who coins the term Sahara. So you've heard the term Beaux-Arts, a French word meaning basically the fine arts. And urban areas are growing technologically faster than their rural counterparts. That's not so much true now. We have, people have iPhones here in rural areas and in urban areas. But in this period, urban life is very, very different from rural life, in large part because of electrification, in large part because of sort of spending money that people have, and there's a sense of sophistication that's there. So Beaux-Arts is an expression meaning fine arts, and so Mencken writes a kind of famous story about the South called Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, spelled Bozart, presumably the Southern pronunciation of the word Beaux-Arts. And he argues that there's no culture in the South. There's nothing interesting about the South. Even the most urban areas are an utter joke. It's nothing but clan bees, lynching bees, and it's a terrible environment. And so making fun of rural people is kind of a common thing that we see in this period. So we see a sharpening divide between this rapidly industrializing urban centers, particularly in the Northeast, and rural places, particularly in the South. Okay. Yes. It is upsetting. People are still angry about the H.L. Mencken. So, in the biggest change in the United States, one of the most important changes in the United States is something that doesn't happen in the United States at all, and that is the submarine, because submarine warfare basically makes it impossible or extremely dangerous, not impossible, but extremely dangerous to move from Europe to the United States. So there had been a stream of people from Northern and Western Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe that have been flowing to the United States from the 1870s, from say the 75, right after the Panic of 1876, all the way up until 1910, all the way up until 1914. That stops with the U-boat. So basically, remember that the British are holding off the Germans in the North Sea. The only way that Germany can respond as it sees it to being kind of penned up in the North Sea is to use submarine warfare. It's, of course, submarine warfare that's going to get the United States involved in this war because of the sinking of the Lusitania and lots of other American ships or ships that have Americans on them. But this basically ends immigration to the North. And this freaks out Henry Ford, right? His whole system is built on unskilled workers who are in these factories, working on the assembly line, a regular flow of them. No one, I can tell you, in many cases, very few people want to stay on assembly lines for a very long time. It's very attractive work because it pays pretty well. It's not work you can do into your 40s and 50s. It's sort of backbreaking work. And so regularly, Ford and Chrysler and all these other companies go through workers like crazy. Turnover is really, really high in these places. And so this makes possible the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. So there had been African Americans that are going from the South to the North, going after slavery, had been going up, the Exodusters in 1877, but there hadn't been that many. Black Southerners who had gone north. But what you see is the same kind of recruiting that happens in Michigan, remember, and Minnesota, people recruiting Mexicans. There's a similar attempt to go into the Deep South and recruit African Americans to work in factories. Ford immediately changes his policy as soon as submarine warfare begins in 1914, saying that Ford was, at this point, a notorious racist and a supporter of the German Kaiser. He nonetheless made the radical decision to accept black workers in his plants in Michigan. It's very much tied to the labor supply. So it's basically, there is a push, right? There are attractions for African Americans to move north, but there's really a pull, and that's by and large because Henry Ford and others have to give up their idea of a white-only plant, which they had supported for many years. So once Ford makes the decision to hire African-American workers, Dodge, Chrysler, Chevrolet, and Packard, the major competitors, also follow and are willing to hire African-Americans. And so African-American folks who are Pullman car porters and others bring down newspapers like the Chicago Defender that have advertising for African-American workers. What we see is a sort of chain migration as a few people move up to take jobs in these factories, then calling on many more African-Americans to move up into these regions. And so this is the Great Migration, 500,000 African-Americans moving from the South to the North from 1914 to 1990. 1914 to 1919. A million more in the 1920s, but this Great Migration really starts as soon as U-boats end up in the water in the North Sea. There's also a movement to areas in the southeast and to rural areas like Texas and New Mexico, but the most important or the most memorable of this Great Migrations is African Americans who moved to northern cities. Now, as I said before, there is some industrialization that happens on the farm. The gas-powered tractor emerges. Ford creates the Fordson around 1917. It takes a little while for these things to take off. This is a Fordson tractor from around 1917, 1918. And this does change agriculture. It does increase the productivity of agriculture. And it also changed land patterns. So it allows lots more land to be put under cultivation right after World War I, when the demand for agriculture increases rapidly, right? The Western Europe can't feed itself as easily because many farmers' boys are being drawn into this fight and millions are dying in World War I. They need food, and so food prices go up. As I said, food prices double in 1915 because of the demand from Europe. Cotton prices also double. And so what farmers do is they expand the land under cultivation because they no longer need horses. The ones who who modernize and buy these gas-powered tractors. And because you no longer have horses, you no longer need pasture land. And so for farmers, this is makes the opportunity to increase your land coverage by about 40%. That you can produce edge-to-edge cotton or edge-to-edge wheat, edge-to-edge corn, without having to have pasture land for your horses. So tremendous competition then in agriculture as millions more acres go into cultivation, which is going to drive down agricultural prices as soon as the war is over. This is a kind of danger sign. Lots and lots of people trying to produce more and more. Lots of northern farmers producing sugar beets, for example, drawing in Mexican laborers in the 19-teens. A crash is going to come in the 20s. This decreases total revenue. Yeah, there is some squeezing out of small farmers, I would say, particularly in cotton. But I would say that the squeezing out of small farmers in cotton doesn't really happen until the 1930s with the New Deal and things like that. It's still possible to actually make a decent, if you've got more than, say, 60 acres or so, it's still possible to do all right in cotton in this period. But yeah, what we're going to see after 1919, after the war is over, after Germany and France and Great Britain can feed themselves, is a plummeting in price in agriculture. Okay, so that's what's going to go on, but that's a sort of danger sign. We haven't seen it yet. Everybody is thrilled about, in Europe, in the United States, is thrilled about the prospects for agriculture in this period. Now I want to talk a little bit about Prohibition and the South and the North. In the period before the war, the strongest forces behind Prohibition were New England and Midwestern evangelicals, particularly people connected to the Whig Party, which falls apart in the 1850s. But the Whig Party wanted to intervene in the affairs of the working class. They wanted to stop the drinking of liquor. Some Southern Baptists opposed drinking before the war, but there wasn't much opposition in the South to alcohol at all. And in fact, there's a tremendous amount of alcohol drinking in the South that's fairly common. Some evangelicals during the American Civil War, however, claimed that the South died of whiskey, and that the upper class habit of drinking cocktails and whiskey all day meant that Confederate officers arrived on the field drunk. They misdirected their soldiers and led them to be slaughtered. And so there is a kind of reckoning about alcohol that comes after the Civil War in the South. But it's probably really only in when we see factories emerge in the South, textile mills, furniture mills, and tobacco mills, that we really see concern about drinking. The perception at these southern mill towns, remember that the cotton mill towns are all white, was that they were wide open towns with heavy drinking and lots of prostitution, but above all, heavy drinking. Yeah, right. To a certain extent, the Republicans are going to continue to support prohibition in the North because there is this Whig legacy, because this sense that they're right. Remember, the Democrats are the party of Germans and Irish who believe in drinking by and large. Unless they're ultra Protestant or something like that, but by and large believe in drinking, and so that's another reason why the Republican Party is going to be opposed to drinking. So some Southern evangelicals try as early as the 1880s to push for anti-drinking laws, but they find very little interest in it. Partly because there's a lot of wine in the Bible. There's even a brief attempt by Southern ministers to argue that Jesus and his disciples didn't drink wine because it was Passover when he met with his disciples, and it was unleavened food, and therefore they called it the fruit of the vine, which could have been grape juice. One of the biggest supporters, though, of temperance is a man named Warren Candler. You may have heard about him if you live near at Atlanta. He was the president of Emory, and he promoted an anti-liquor carbonated drinks. His brother, Asa Candler, founded a company that produces a drink that initially has a stimulant derived from coca leaves. Now, Coca-Cola will tell you that there never were coca leaves in Coca-Cola. This is a total lie. Basically, Coca-Cola, though, is an attempt. It's an attempt to sort of replace alcohol with sugared beverages. And so this is an ad for Coca-Cola in this period. As you can see, it's specific for headache. It relieves mental and physical exhaustion. He calls it Coca-Cola, and the South's love affair with overpriced sugar beverages begins. Oh, that's funny. The street to go on Candler Street. Another serious supporter of prohibition were populists, actually. They complained about what they called the Bourbon Democrats. That's people like Henry Grady and others who supported segregation, who supported disfranchisement. The populist criticism was, a reference to the French Bourbons, who never learned and never forgot, but also the idea that Democrats, who were the old Bourbon Democrats, got people to vote for them by providing them with lots and lots of alcohol at barbecues before the election day, and that this was terrible. So you did see populists who were also anti-drinking. Tom Watson of Georgia, presidential candidate, but then vice presidential candidate, is also strong believer in in alcohol reform. Now, there are serious problems with binge drinking in the South, though, with lots of people dying of alcohol poisoning, lots of broken families. But the elite tradition of treating drinks meant that many elite white Southerners did not want to hear about prohibition. So there is an interest in this brain tonic called Coca-Cola, but there isn't a whole lot of interest in prohibition in the South until 1906. And in 1906, we have what's called the Atlanta Race Riot. And this it begins with a few reports, not necessarily accurate, of black men raping white women. This often happens in these kinds of riots. Now, this riot is basically led by white men. 10,000, upwards of 10,000 white men who move through Atlanta, breaking windows, swinging axe handles, and killing black men. And axe handle has become a kind of symbol of opposition to African-American civil rights and others, and the axe handle becomes a kind of symbol of sort of white supremacy in this period. The Southern evangelicals quickly respond to the 1906 race riot by saying that it's caused by liquor. They say the story is that black men, fueled by liquor, are raping white women, and that prohibition will stop this. And that white men, fueled by liquor, go on a rampage and kill people in Atlanta. And so for this reason, Lester Maddox is associated with the axe handle later. This leads To a sense, people who are upset about the riot for because it hurts black people. Also, people are upset about the riot because of the story, the fake, made up story, possibly made up story about the raping white women, lead to a growing sense that prohibition might be a good thing. It becomes an organized campaign, and it leads to the first state prohibition in Georgia. First state prohibition takes place in Georgia in 1907, and it's followed in the next decade throughout the South, and then the whole country in 1919. So Georgia is really the beginning of this, and it's right after the Atlanta race riot that we see the push for prohibition. At the same time, sugar-sweetened, caffeinated drinks become a kind of panacea. A drink where the drug is not alcohol, but the drug is caffeine and sugar that keeps people alert. It's the standard food of cotton mill workers and farmers from the 19 teens forward. In fact, yes, this is why there are still dry counties, because and this is why you can't buy liquor in Georgia before noon on Sunday. It's the same reason, is that this was a state law. It gradually was lowered, but it's still here. Yeah, that's why you can't buy liquor by the drink, I think, in many counties in Georgia still. So the standard food of mill workers gets worse by the 19 teens. Mill workers' lunch becomes peanuts poured into a half-finished Coke bottle. Have you guys? Is this a familiar lunch for you guys? Do you know about this? The taking a Coke bottle, drinking about half of it, then pouring peanuts into it, and finishing it. It's called the mill workers' lunch, and it probably was connected to workers who came back, who were in the factory, didn't have a lot of time, and and their hands were dirty, so they didn't want to touch the peanuts. So they poured it into the bottle and finished it that way, so they didn't have to touch the peanuts because their hands were covered with coal dust and stuff like that. Oh, wow. Oh, you worked in tobacco fields, and that's where you're giving it lunch. Yeah. Okay. Right. And so this is where it comes from. As Coke emerges, this becomes the mill workers' lunch. It also becomes a farm workers' lunch, as Jacob suggested. That makes perfect sense. And it's also easy. Lots and lots of packaged food. Now we're going to talk on Wednesday about how bad packaged food is for Southerners, because it does a number. All this cheap food that's coming from the North and the Midwest does a number on the South over time. It leads to all sorts of problems. But I don't know. Give it a try. I'm not a big fan, but so the battle over temperance in the 1840s was teetotaling Yankees versus hard-drinking Southerners. After 1906, it becomes Southerners, particularly in rural areas, against Yankees, who pretty much abandoned temperance, especially in urban areas. And this is where this rural-urban split comes really to play, because it's rural areas, by and large, that support prohibition. Rural areas that see drinking as being the central problem. And so we see the 18th Amendment that prohibits sale of intoxicating liquors. Now you'll see a different version of explanation for this than in the readings, but I want to suggest that this rural-urban split is really important for understanding what goes on. This is roundly rejected in cities. As soon as 1920 hits, as soon as it becomes, this is probably why obesity rates, all that sugar, is roundly rejected in urban cities. The state of New York basically refuses to enforce prohibition. Detroit and Buffalo boom as entrepôts for Seagram's liquor illegally imported from Canada. So from 1920 forward, you again see cities, particularly in the North, particularly these urban industrial cities with lots of immigrants and lots of African Americans, basically ignoring this law. This is where you get speakeasies. This is where you get bathtub gin. This is where you get all sorts of people producing alcohol on their own. Important for the rural-urban split is that many voters in the South, overwhelmingly rural, see liquor as one of the many temptations of the city that lead men and women astray. Their fear and perhaps jealousy of the city leads them to crack down on drinking. Meanwhile, many urban residents resent the rural areas, seeing illegal drinking as even more exotic. Now, one other interesting and peculiar effect is that it fuels a long-standing, simmering conflicts in. That's interesting. I didn't know that. It actually reinvigorates many of the clans that had been. This is not the K clans, but the C clans, like the Hatfields and the McCoys and others, who in the mountains make lots and lots of liquor. And so what we see is the rural South rejects it. People up in the mountains are making it. People up down in the city are consuming it. So to conclude, and word has died again. I tell you. What we've seen then is a few changes. We see under the Diaz regime a revolution that takes place over a sort of a moving of many people off the land and into factories and elsewhere. The Mexican Revolution leads to a massive migration from Mexico to the United States, as there's chaos in parts of Mexico for about 10 years. We see the attraction of workers into this Midwest and a migrant stream of workers. We also see a growing divide between the North and the South. After the U-boat, we see a migration of African Americans to urban places. And then we see Prohibition, which is, as I've suggested, suggestive of tensions between the urban and rural places. Yes, and that's why FDR was elected for 3 terms, and elected for 4 terms, though he only served 3. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for putting up with my technical snafus here.